All right, I'm here with the creators of the Tuttle Twins, Connor Boyack and Elijah Stanfield. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Joel.
Super excited to have you guys on. You know, you are a staple in my household and many others. And for really, my family, we raise our kids homeschool. And I was joking with you offline that not only do my kids learn from your books, but I learn as well. So really excited to kind of dive into this. And I know you guys have a new history book coming out July 4th. And so we're definitely going to talk about that. But before we even do any of that, I'm always curious, like, how did this creation of what you guys have created, the Tuttle Twins, how did it come about? And like, was there a day that you both realized, like, we've got to do something because the way history is being portrayed or the way that kids are learning, it's missing. We're missing something.
I'll jump in and Elijah can go next. Elijah and I met at Freedom Fest, which is a kind of libertarian free market type conference. Gosh, when was that? I want to say it was 2012, maybe 2011. And Elijah can maybe correct me if he remembers differently. But we had met, we had kind of seen in one another, like, hey, you're like-minded. Hey, you're talented. Hey, and so we developed a friendship and had kind of a line of communication. We would throw out ideas. And the conversation eventually started going to children's books, at least on my part, because I'm running a think tank at the time. I had just launched Libertas Institute, and we're changing all these laws. I'm fighting for freedom. And my son, who was 5, who was 5 at the time, I would come home, and one day, like I did most days, hey, tell me what you did today. And he played with so-and-so, and he watched this cartoon. But this one day he asked me, Dad, what did you do today? And I was like, I don't want to just say I typed on my computer or I made phone calls, right? Like the question was prompted of like, how do I talk to kids about this? I went on Amazon, there's books for birds and the bees and everything, right, that you might want to teach your kids. So I'm like, oh, surely there should be books to teach the ideas of freedom, and search, nothing at all. And so as Elijah and I were talking and kicking around this idea for what became our first book, I think we both kind of recognized, like, hey, there's some potential here. We didn't know if it would work. We didn't know if people would buy the book. It was very much an experiment, to the point where Elijah and I were like, hey, if this flops, what's the one book that we would want to create together that would be super impactful? So that's why we chose The Law by Bastiat as our first. Elijah, did I miss any of our backstory? Fill in some color. What did I miss?
You pretty much got it.
So I got a couple of you guys do like a series of books, and I've got a couple of some of my favorites here that the boys really love. I think we've read Food Truck. If anybody's watching on video, you can see Food Truck is one of our favorites. The Creature of Jekyll Island, that's an eye-opening one. And this is one of the books, like I say, wow, I learned some stuff about the Federal Reserve, and I was reading it. I'm like, what the heck? This really happened. And then there is a book called The Creature of Jekyll Island that I just recently read. And so it's just mind-blowing. It's really cool to be able to go to some of these stories. And not only am I learning, but so are my boys.
Yeah.
I was curious too. You guys have a history book out. You already have version 1 from 1215 to 1776, and you've got another one coming out July 4th, 2023. I'm curious. The last couple of years we had a pandemic. I, as a natural health guy, was censored like crazy. Many of us were censored for, you guys, I'm sure too, for saying the quote unquote truth, if you will. And I was thinking, man, it's got to be really hard for you guys to cipher through and distinguish, what do we believe to be true? Because someone else would say, that's not true. That's absolutely not true. And then this is true. And I know, for one thing, just looking at the pandemic, I saw how in real time, how history has been rewritten, how ideas like the burning of the books, for example. And so I'm curious, it must be very difficult to go through and decide and present history in a way where you say, we're really getting the facts. And I think this is a good way to present it. So how do you guys is there a framework, or how do you guys look at that?
Elijah, you take that one.
Well, we were working on that history book. I think we started right before the pandemic. And as I was illustrating and as we were doing the research to write this, it was really fascinating to see before us a lot of similarities between what the colonists were dealing with and what we were dealing with in this pandemic. Lots of government overreach, changing of the narrative, and what to do about it. And the founding generation, they reacted in such a brilliant way, and we weren't acting in that way. And I would just wanted to share like all the things that I'd been learning, to say, no, like we could do this instead. We don't need to do it this way. And I could get in specifically the way the colonists dealt with the Stamp Act was amazing. They didn't try to elect people to represent them. They didn't try to go to their politicians. They didn't try to address. They did try to address the king, but the real people that really dealt with the Stamp Act so effectively is they saw the bureaucrats that were interacting with them directly, the redcoats, the tax collectors, and they understood that these were actually the aggressors, the person that was enforcing the laws, the right to your face. And they dealt with those people. And without those people, the king had no power. And the Stamp Act never actually went into any meaningful circulation, and because they ended it day one. They just went to the bureaucrats and the tax collectors and all the people that were involved with this, and just ended it. Said, resign now, or we burn down your house. And they all resigned.
So is that the solution? Like with these bureaucrats, making, and we saw a lot of mandates and just, I mentioned to you guys, man, I lost my job. I mean, these were some heinous things that were being done, really, and they had no basis. If they had some basis or some meat, we could say, okay, maybe that was justified, but they didn't. And there's a lot of proof showing that. But
Joel, let me add on briefly to that, because you asked an important question. Like, I mean, it's perhaps a question in jest. Should we be, burning people's houses down as well? But, Jefferson and the others who wrote the Declaration of Independence talked about in there how mankind as humans, we're more likely to suffer while evils are sufferable than we are to throw off this yoke of subjugation that we're under. Wow. And so he was observing that throughout history, people were living under tyranny, and it was all incremental, and it was, bit by bit until it was this heavy thing. And yet they were still suffering. And so it's not that Elijah or I certainly are not advocating, going out into the street and lynching a tax collector. But to me, the curious thing about history is it shows you how firmly these people were standing up for the things that they believed in, to the point of potential confrontation, because they recognized, like, it wasn't just that they were selfish or they wanted something themselves. They recognized this broader problem. James Madison says, and I'm going to butcher the quote, but he says something like, we saw in the first instance of a violation of a principle the long-term effect of what would happen if that principle were allowed to be violated. And so we had to nip in the bud at the very outset these violations of our freedom, because if we allowed, think of like the income tax, right? When it was finally introduced 100 and some odd 20, 30 years later, and the Constitution was amended, it was justified as super incremental, right? Oh, it'll only be like 1% and no big deal, and only on the rich. And now everyone's paying like 25, 30, 40%, depending on where you're at. So to me, that's the interesting thing, reading about some of these folks from history, is their willingness to just not tolerate, in a lot of cases at least, not tolerate this incrementalism of encroaching upon their liberty. It was, the Stamp Act, ultimately not this like massive crisis and this horrible oppression. It was more that they were seeing it for what it was, the principle that stood for, and the long-term effect if Parliament and the king were able to continue doing things like this. It was that compound long-term effect. And so they're like, no, we're going to stop this now. To me, that's a great learning opportunity of like, hey, when things happen like this, how can I stand up and say this far and no further, right? It's like Gandalf, you shall not pass, right? And like, you got to have that line in the sand to say, here is where I fight, because otherwise it's just incremental, and then we end up losing.
Yeah, I think the thing that I wanted to see from the Americans, my community, it wasn't burning down, the bureaucrats and the health person of the county, but I was I became ultra aware that those those early colonists, the British had created a monster that they hadn't understood what they were doing. They sent them out to another continent, hundreds of miles away, thousands of miles away. And for 200 years, they built their own communities. And as soon as they started to encroach upon that, the Americans were, wait a second, we don't do that. Like they were free people.
It's so, but I love what you said, because we saw that too just in the pandemic. The people that stood up and actually fought and drew the line actually got things done. And I can only relate just in a very small way, just watching mandates run through police organizations, and the groups that actually stood still and said, in the masses, we're not going to do this, it's wrong. They didn't lose their jobs. It was very interesting. But and yet in communities like San Francisco, people lost their jobs. In Los Angeles, they didn't. And the difference was they're both very political. They're the same political climate. You could say they're both equal, but the difference was LA stood up within just, I'm just talking about the microcosm of police work. So it was really interesting to see. And I think you're right. And it reminds me too of this book that I read a while back called Nonviolent Communication. And it talks about the book is all about how to communicate in a nonviolent way, but the book is talking about the power of language, and how, for example, in Germany, the Nazis, the soldiers, when they would ask him, like, why are you doing this? They would always retort, like, oh, this is just the way things are. I was given an order. We don't know. This is just what we do. And they actually had a joke about this language. They created they called it like bourgeois, like office kind of talk. And it was called Amtsprache. And it just meant like, this is our answer to everything that you say. And it was just, they denied responsibility. They created a language of denial of responsibility.
Right.
And where does that lead? That's the question.
Well, and that's why history in my mind is so critical, because this stuff, even though the circumstances are different and our time is different, you see those same tendencies today, right? Like you see people who just want to shirk accountability. And for me, we all know this quote. We put it on the back of our history books, in fact. Are the one that you hold up on the back. It says, "Those who don't learn from the past are condemned to repeat it." Right? And we all know this quote. We've all heard it before. The problem is that if we want the rising generation to learn from the past, both the good and the bad, right? We want to learn from the mistakes of the past so that we don't repeat those. But if we want them to do that so that they can learn, say, from the founding fathers, like with the example that Elijah mentioned, or a host of others, we have to teach them not just about history, right? This thing happened on this date, and these people wrote a letter to these people, and the clouds looked like this on that day, and they wore this color of, coat, uniform. And right, we can't just teach them about history. We have to teach kids to learn from it. And that is an entirely different consideration when it comes to teaching history that the schools don't even try doing. I mean, with rare exception, they're all just teaching kids about history. And so there's this massive generational disconnect, because all these kids grow up learning all these factoids about history that they don't care about, and they don't understand why they need to. So it goes in one ear and out the other. And all the while, they're not learning the mistakes of the past. And so we repeat them again and again. And then you look around during COVID, and it's like, oh, okay, we got, a bunch of idiots around us who are just willing to surrender their freedom in the name of safety, because they don't know all the times where the government has violated our rights by telling us, hey, this is necessary to keep you safe, when that's not in fact true. Our whole goal with these history books then is to try and help kids learn from history so that we can apply those ideas today and stop this cyclical downward cycle where we're losing our freedoms. I hated history as a kid. I couldn't stand memorizing all this irrelevant stuff. I was the kid that would raise my hand and say, why do we need to learn this? Oh, it'll be on the test, and I really struggled with history. And it wasn't until much later, post college, where I developed an interest in it, because I started reading these like nonfiction, almost like storybooks, you might say, but just biographies and tales of history. And I'm like, wow, this is super fascinating. And I started to reflect on like, why do I finally like history? And then when I finally it clicked, it was like, oh, I'm reading stories. It's narrative format. It's like that. None of my textbooks did that. It was all disjointed and discombobulated. And so our books use storytelling to teach kids the ideas of history, because it works. It's how our brains are wired. And so the goal is that if we use storytelling as the vehicle, kids are not only going to learn various things about history, but more importantly, they're going to be very interested in and retain the lessons from history that they can apply in the future. That's kind of the MO behind what we're doing with the books.
Yeah, it's amazing. You guys also have the workbooks too that you send out. You also have like something that we subscribe to is kind of like these little monthly pamphlets, kind of a lesson in them every month. And so you guys are kind of hitting it from really all angles, which is really neat.
Yeah, absolutely. Elijah, are you back with us? If so, you want to talk about the magazine?
How's my microphone working now?
There you go.
Oh, good. The magazine. Well, we realized that every, you know how the establishment, like let's say,
Yeah.
there's this narrative that pops up every week, every other week, something that everyone's supposed to be talking about, right? The buzz. What's the latest buzz? And we realized that we couldn't keep up by just doing 2 or 3 books a year. We needed to have something to come out every month to talk about what's everyone's talking about and kind of give a perspective about it that not many people are talking about, but we feel is the correct perspective, the one that um, enforces the idea of freedom.
Mm.
So this magazine, we've been doing it for almost 2 years, and how many? Yeah, we got lots of people subscribed, and it's doing great. We're keep improving every month, and we really like it.
Yeah. No, it's awesome. And it's awesome to kind of I love it because it just keeps me in tune with, we have all the books, but it keeps the conversation moving
Right.
on a regular, right? So we can keep those conversations going with, like you said, what's going on currently.
When Elijah and I started, Joel, we thought of these as children's books. We now see them more as family educational resources for a couple reasons. You've mentioned both. The first is that the adults are learning a lot as well that they never learned in school, because none of us learned these things in school. So it's we're hitting older kids, we're, the siblings, we're hitting the adults as well. So the whole family can often learn new things with these ideas. But these books aren't just like, yay, okay, I read a book, now moving on, right? It's meant to spark discussion. Like, our whole goal is to enrich family discussions so that parents and kids can talk about ideas that matter. And maybe that's not the same evening that you read the book, right? But we're planting seeds. And so let's say you're reading The Creature from Jekyll Island with your kids, and it talks about money and inflation and why it happens. And then like 3 weeks, and I'm kind of like summarizing like 18 different parent emails that we've gotten that share stories like this. So it could be 3 weeks later, you're driving to the store with, your family, and the radio's playing, and someone mentions inflation. And your, 8-year-old pipes up from the back and says, "Oh, that's because of The Creature from Jekyll Island," right? And now they're making a connection to this present day circumstance, where the thing that they learned, they're learning from it, they're applying it to a modern current context. And so then the family can talk about it and what it means, and everything else. And so really it's planting those seeds, it's having those discussions. At the end of the day, Elijah and I, like, our feeling is we're not going to save our country in the Capitol or at the courtroom. We're going to save our if we're going to save our country, it's going to be at the dinner table, where we're, encouraging critical thinking with the rising generation, skepticism of authority. We're teaching them truth. We're preparing them to for this ideological, psychological warfare that we're in our society. That's how we save our freedoms, is by supporting families like yours and many others to say, hey, let's read and discuss together.
I love that. And I was just thinking too, because I asked you kind of earlier, is like, how do you say, like, this is what's true, but it doesn't, it's really, because the way I look at it is, in my own, I just turned 41, and man, I look back and I'm like the school system and a lot of these things were to indoctrinate me. And I almost feel like this was all like a big lie. Like, then you start reading other books that explain a completely different realm. And so that's what you guys are doing. Maybe someone else would still say, well, you guys got it wrong, but you're just sharing the other side. And I saw that in the pandemic. Like, I would tell people, like, that's great that the CDC and all these people are telling you have to go do this. I'm just sharing you with you the other doctors who are saying that's absolutely not true.
Yeah. The danger, Elijah, chime in. I know you have thoughts on this too. We don't even want people to trust us, right? Like we the challenge is, a lot of parents are like, oh, a trustworthy brand, and let me just buy all the books and my kids will like, no, no, no. Like, because you need to develop critical thinking with your kids so that maybe like, I'll give you a very specific example. In that first history book that you held up, we said some things about the development of kind of Christianity and how that influenced the founding fathers. And in there, we talk about how there was this fight with the, the Catholic Church. A lot of people felt that the Pope and the Catholic leaders were, causing problems for people, not allowing them to read the Bible on their own. And so then you had, Tinsdale and others out there creating the Bible. So anyways, we talk about this, and there were a lot of Catholics who have reached out and said, we disagree with that. We don't like that characterization. I was responding yesterday on Instagram to one, and I said, hey, yeah, like, we've got some good feedback. Elijah and I will consider for the next reprint if we can say things a little bit better that, we don't want to offend, but we want to be accurate.
Yeah.
So we'll massage it. But I said, hey, this is actually a great learning opportunity for your kids, right? Here's this trusted brand that you've read all these books, but there's something where you're like, I don't know if that sits well. Great. Have a discussion about it. Go research it more. Teach your kids what you believe. Have them engage in that discussion. And so we can use these as learning opportunities, because Elijah and I, the last thing we want is just to brainwash a bunch of kids in freedom ideas.
Right.
We want to develop critical thinking, and that means even challenging Elijah and myself.
Yeah.
I think the idea of a principle, a social principle, political principle, economic principle, is that it's a science. If it really is truly a principle, then you should be able to apply it in every situation, and it will work. And what we've been trying to do is teach these principles so that they can apply them on their own. Because what you'll see politicians and different parties do is they like the principle when it applies here, but when it goes over to this subject, then they're not going to apply it. They don't think it's going to work. Or whether it's either not a principle that they're applying, or it is a principle and they just are afraid to do it. So so teaching principles, and all of our books are based off of the works of great thinkers of the past who have tried to discover true principles that can be applied universally. And so, I mean, that's why I think that these books are so powerful, is that we're teaching these principles and saying, this is how they can be applied in our day, in economics and politics and in social circumstances. And now you can go and take those principles and apply them to any instance in your life.
Yeah, so good. Principles over emotions. I mean, you stay in that. That's a great way to think about it. Okay, this last book was 1215 to 1776. This next book that's dropping July 4th, I'm assuming, is going to be 1776 to kind of how far is that going to go? And tell us, like, what are you excited about that this one is going to reveal? I'm excited about it because at the last conference that I got to see you speak at, Connor, which was We the Patriots, I mean, I was connecting with people and I was learning all kinds of things about a lot of some things I'd never heard about history from that occurred in 1776 and occurred right after that. And there were some big things that I had no idea about. So I'm really curious to hear kind of the things we can expect for this new book.
Well, this next book covers from 1776 through 1791. So what that means is it's the creation of the Constitution. Well, I got ahead of myself. It's the right after the Declaration of Independence. It's all the battles, the core battles in the Revolutionary War. It's the creation of the Constitution, and then the adoption of the Bill of Rights. And so that's where we cap the book. We have ideas and goals of doing a third and a fourth, and we'll see if we are able to keep this going. But this one covers these like core years, and of course there's a lot of meat happening in this book. In the first book, as you point out, it's a multiple centuries long time span that we're covering to get everyone up to speed, right, leading up to 1776. This one we slow down a bit to say, hey, there's a lot of stuff happening, let's talk about it. And one of the really kind of unique insights that I think families are going to come away with is there's always this concept that the victor gets to frame history. Yeah. Right. The victor in any war gets to like set the narrative that children for generations to come will be taught about what actually happened. And so we're not immune from that in the land of the so-called land of the free. Right. And so you have this idea where the folks who supported the Constitution and the Federalists writing the Federalist Papers advocating for the adoption of the Constitution, They had this vision. They were great propagandists. They were pushing this idea, and millions of kids grow up in high school reading Federalist Papers and being taught that perspective. I didn't learn until college that there was such a thing as the anti-federalists, right? And they were branded that way by their opponents because federalism was a sexy word, and they're like, oh, those are the guys who oppose federalism. What you'll discover in our book is that the anti-federalists were actually the true federalists. They were the ones that wanted to preserve and protect state power. They didn't want the central government to grow. They kind of, I don't know, prognosticated or suggested that the central government under the Constitution would not be constrained by it, even with the Bill of Rights later being adopted. And so when you go back and read, it's the anti-federalists who are actually proven true, and yet their views are suppressed. So our whole thing is, let's elevate like unheard of and rarely discussed history. Let's not bury it just because the victors, it's inconvenient to them. Let's put the victors and their adversaries in the same plane, conservatives and liberals, which back then meant something entirely different than it does today, right? Tories and Whigs, Federalists, anti-federalists, all these guys. Let's elevate their ideas, because ultimately our book focuses on ideas. We talk about the battles and the history and everything, but it's a very idea-rich set of books. We want to know, what were they debating and what were they concerned about and what were they discussing? And so we bring those ideas and kind of test them and evaluate them along the way, so that kids can be like, oh, there were actually kind of competing ideas, and who is right? Should we just assume that whoever won is right? Is that how we should decide today? What is truth? Going back to your question, is like, oh, the COVIDians and the lockdown crazies, right? They quote unquote won. Does that mean what they all said was true? Well, no, right? So this is these are the conversations we want to have with kids. Elijah, what have I missed?
Well, you hit some of my favorite parts. I mean, the anti-federalists were some of our favorite people during the Revolution. Sam Adams, Thomas Jefferson. These were the heroes of the Revolution, and then all of a sudden they were put in the back and called anti-federalists. And then the Alexander Hamiltonian types, they pushed a totally different narrative, and they ended up winning. They had to have a compromise with those anti-federalists, and that was the Bill of Rights. And if you understand the two arguments and how they came together to create what we have today, then you'll understand that we are so far gone from where we started and what was agreed upon during those ratifying conventions. And if we would just return to that mindset, it would solve so many problems.
What's crazy, Elijah, I think, is that imagine had that compromise not happened, right? And the so-called anti-federalists not created the pressure to say, hey, we need these guarantees in this Bill of Rights. Because, Joel, as I've mentioned, I run this think tank. We, file lawsuits and change laws and everything. So many of our efforts to protect our freedom boil down to the First Amendment and the Second Amendment and the Fourth Amendment. Not so much the third. We're not really, quartering troops inside people's homes right now, but
not yet.
Not yet. These core amendments are so powerful and have been, what I think Madsen called it, a parchment barrier, right? Like, it's not been perfect. The government is still grown, and I mean, the NSA is listening in on this conversation right now, despite having a Fourth Amendment.
Yeah.
But it at least has been a vehicle with which to try and sometimes successfully restrain the government. I cannot imagine what our country would be like today without the Bill of Rights. And that is the vision that the Federalists had. They were saying, here's the Constitution. And, they had a mechanism to amend it and improve it. They weren't saying it was utopian. But man, good thing that those anti-federalists forced, these concessions, because America would be radically different and way worse had we not gotten those so-called guarantees.
It's so funny you guys are talking about this. I just started reading a lot myself about the anti-federalists, and I'm like, wow, these guys actually seems like they were more to our core of what America was supposed to be or wanted to be. And I just started, and I've gone down this rabbit hole, and I know you guys know about it, the straw man. And so I'll just leave it at that. But I've been going down, and I'm like, oh my God, like these guys were actually really, but that's not how history was portrayed about them. And so it's really, really interesting when you start kind of getting into those, like you said, those papers and what they were thinking and their ideas and what was actually getting published in newspapers. Really, really interesting.
One thing that blew my mind when we were studying and getting this history book, the second history book ready, was the discussion about the central bank, the Fed, the holy Fed. those interests, those special interests for a central bank, were there wanting this constitution, because you can't have a fractional reserve system without having direct taxation power. And that's what the Articles of Confederation lacked, and that's what will be told in the elementary schools and high schools and colleges, is that the Articles of Confederation was so weak because they couldn't tax the people directly. And what we'll see is, I'll just
Spoiler
tell you the end of the story. Spoiler alert is they created a central bank. Alexander Hamilton created a central bank before the Bill of Rights was even passed. It was the first thing on the menu. And even James Madison, who penned the Constitution, said, wait, we talked about this before. We weren't going to do this. And they're like, well, Congress voted on it, necessary and proper. See ya. And, and really, I think we're all starting to see now is, if you have power to print money, to create money, to control money, you control everything. Democratic powers, the republic, not much of that matters if they are controlling everything in the economy through their printing. And if that was just one message I could just get out to the majority of people, because I think it's something that universally most people would agree with. This is theft. This is totally dishonest system. This is totally corrupt. If they understood the way the central banking system works, they would, almost every normal person would be like, yeah, that's completely corrupt. And if we could get that changed, man, the world would be so much better, so much different.
Yeah, so good. I mean, you guys talk about that a little bit in Jekyll Island, and that's why it's one of my favorites, and it forced me to ask a lot more questions. So, I wanted to ask you guys both, and I was just thinking, and I know we only have about 10 more minutes left, and I was thinking, man, if we know that there's some people like us out there that we're like, man, everything's just a big lie. And I'm working, and we're doing homeschooling and doing other things, and maybe there's different monetary systems like Bitcoin. How else, other than reading Tuttle Twins and thinking about ideas, how else do you think about raising our kids and getting them to think critically? Like, what else are you guys doing, maybe other than things like homeschool and other things I'll give you another example. I just realized, and I had a guy on my podcast, and I just realized the racket of healthcare. And so I'm doing things like that to get out of the matrix of healthcare, and just doing other things. But I'm curious, are there anything else that you guys are doing? I mean, obviously you're doing such great work with just the Tuttle Twins, but anything that you guys do personally, maybe with your family or anything else?
One thing that I do is, I stopped reading the news a long time ago, and basically now how I get my news is kind of a curated social media. Like, if I see multiple people all talking about this on Twitter, for example, then I'll be like, okay, let me look into this just so I kind of know what's going on. But whenever it's anything, let's take, at the time we're recording this, right, we just had this whole Russian alleged coup, and everyone freaked out, and then it stopped, and then we're like, wait, was this a ruse? Did it not actually happen? And so one of the things that I try and do, and it's hard, is to reserve judgment. It can be so easy to read a headline, to assume truth. It's so crazy. You look at the polls, and well over 70% of Americans say they don't trust the media. They don't find them trustworthy. They don't think they're looking out for our best interest consistently. I think it's 77, 78% distrust the media, or say that they do. And that's the kicker. We it's like everyone who criticizes public schools, but then say, "Oh, but my kids' teachers are great," right? It's this dichotomy, or this disconnect. And so people say that they distrust the media, and yet then they read some flashy article, and their prefrontal cortex shuts down. They have the emotional response to this information they're encountering, and the alligator brain kicks in, and we just react and assume that it's true. So a lot of what I personally try and do is just say, with this Russia thing, I was like, okay, that's interesting. Some people said that, but I know how often the government lies and how often this stuff is propaganda. So that may be happening here. Maybe not. Maybe it's completely whatever. I don't know. I am not going to give the benefit of the doubt to known liars, to these politicians and the media who have not earned our trust, and quite the opposite. And so it ends up creating this longer time horizon to try and understand what actually happened. The sad thing is sometimes we'll never know, and sometimes it'll be 40 years before some report is declassified and we realize it was all a shell game or whatever. But with my kids, when they hear something that a friend is talking about or something that I want to just bring up with them over dinner, I try and just help them understand that, like, we're in a mind war, and there are people who want to deceive us for their own purposes. And so we can't believe that they have our best interests at heart. We have to develop some skepticism of authority. We need to challenge authority, including me as their parent. Like, hey, not everything I tell you is true. I may believe it's true. It may not actually be true. Your job is to evaluate and challenge. They're kids. They're not great at this, but that's at least the approach that I try to take, is just to encourage a bit of critical thinking and skepticism through these current events that give very acute examples to my kids and to me of, like, hey, here's an example. Was there actually an alleged coup? Or might it be that the Pentagon announced, that they were missing over $60 billion a few days prior, and maybe there's some money laundering and crazy proxy war stuff happening. So I'll stop rambling. Elijah, over to you.
I think that something that doesn't maybe seem like it directly applies, but what I try to do with my kids is to instill in them some courage and some confidence in life, that they to not be afraid and fall into these traps that I think that schools and just society in general try to tell you that you can't do things. I draw pictures for a living, and that's that's crazy. But I'm doing it, and you can find a way to do what you want to do, and you can control your life and be what you want to be, and don't settle for anything less. And I do think that does apply to freedom. I think that's what freedom is having that courage to have a goal. There's something you want to do with your life. Work hard at it and make it happen.
Yeah, amazing. I know you guys got to run, so last couple questions. Just obviously we have the new book, history book coming out, but any other exciting projects you guys are working on after this one drops, or anything else we can expect?
So for the history book, since we didn't mention that yet, that's at TuttleTwins.com/history, where you can check out both books. We have a bundle deal. We've got curriculum and videos and audiobooks. We create this whole package. It's a pretty compelling deal. So TuttleTwins.com/history is where you can find that. The book that Elijah and I are working on right now is we have this series of books for teens. We have a fiction series for teens, and we have a nonfiction series for teens. The nonfiction series, they're called guidebooks. So, for example, we have the Tuttle Twins Guide to Logical Fallacies, and every chapter has little cartoons and things breaking down what this particular logical fallacy is, like a straw man, right? We've also got the Tuttle Twins Guide to Inspiring Entrepreneurs. Every chapter is a story of a different entrepreneur. So we got all these different guidebooks. The one we're working on right now is the Tuttle Twins Guide to True Conspiracies. And every chapter is going to be a different conspiracy, quote unquote, theory that turns out it's actually true. So here's this declassified document, or here's this investigative, journalism that kind of ferreted out what actually happened. I think we've got 20 different examples of just crazy corruption and some very egregious examples of government conspiracy. And the whole point of the book is just to say, if this happened, a few years ago, a few decades ago, or whatever, like, it's probably happening today too. So again, maybe be skeptical of what you hear and suspicious of authority, because, there's so much corruption and we've been lied to again and again.
By the way, just before you respond, I think that book I could give a stocking stuffer to family members too. I mean, this conspiracy theory, like, they probably think I'm a conspiracy theorist, but I mean, hey, I can be like, well, here's a kid's book showing 20 other examples. I mean, am I that crazy to think that? So what say you, Elijah?
Well, I think the first thing that we do before we start any project is we ask why. And everything that we put out, we really want to blow people's minds, change them, put some sort of seed in their mind, something they can't ever ignore, or forget. And so, I mean, this next book, True Conspiracies, is one of those ones. You read through that, your mind is going to be changed. You're going to realize that the government and their bureaucratic corporations are not to be trusted.
Yeah, well said. Guys, last but not least, and I know you just dropped the book, but where can people connect with you, find out more about what you guys are up to, and just learn more?
TuttleTwins.com is where it's at. The books are on Amazon, but you get a better deal, and we got all kinds of bundle deals and things. If you head to TuttleTwins.com, we got books for children, for kind of elementary school. We got toddler books, which are super cute and silly and fun, and we got these teen books. We've got curriculum. We've got our own podcast, a cartoon, a game. So we're trying to create this like content empire that touches kids in all kinds of ways to teach them these ideas. So you can head to TuttleTwins.com, click the products link at the top. You'll see the whole list of everything we have to offer depending on age and whatever you want to do. And Elijah and I are super easy to find on social media. Our Tuttle Twins accounts always share spicy memes, so make sure you can follow us there. And I appreciate being able to come on with you, Joel.
Yeah, I love it. Thanks, guys. Elijah, any last words?
No, just thanks for having us on, Joel. It's been cool.
Yeah, appreciate guys. I appreciate you guys and all the work you're doing. I mean, and I'm sure you hear it all the time, but you're really making a difference out there. And I mean, hitting it where the kids are. I mean, I couldn't. I'm not to say that I couldn't do it. I'm sure I could if I really wanted to. But you're doing it. And you're doing such a great job. And it just from one parent to another, just really appreciate it. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks again, Joel.